Yeah,
Hold
so
on.
like I was saying, our Destination Home is a little bit different than most other nonprofits on this issue, right? A lot of them are doing great work running shelters, building more affordable housing, providing services directly to people experiencing homelessness. We were created really out of a task force about a decade ago that said we need some other people who are helping shepherd big strategies, getting people to work together to end homelessness. And so we do a lot of work with government officials, the private sector, all to see what are some things we can do together to attack this really big crisis. I help run our policy, public policy, and communications initiatives. Before this, I was spent about a decade working at San Jose City Hall under the last two mayors. So I've seen this issue from a couple of different sides. And so just really excited here today to kind of give you guys some information that's been helpful for me as I get to know more about this issue. And I think for those of you who are interested, or even if you're not that interested in the issue, the one big takeaway as you're looking at this is that there's a lot of nuance. There's a lot of complexity to this issue that I hope you guys will think about when you look at it. We all have our own visceral reactions when we see someone experiencing homelessness or signs of homelessness in our community. That's natural. But I think the one thing that's important for all of us as communities is to understand, take under the hood a little bit more about what's going on with this crisis and just help us have some perspective because it shows that there's a lot of things we can do to solve it, but it's not as easy as it always seems. So I'm going to get going. I ended up talking much longer than I thought I would last time, so apologies in advance. But I think we're going to do this in kind of 2 10-minute chunks. We'll stop halfway through so you guys can ask some questions. I can take a sip of coffee, and then we'll end at the time with as much time for questions as you guys want. All right. So first of all, what is homelessness look like in our community? And to no one's surprise here, we're facing a crisis, right? Any given night, there's about 10,000 people who are experiencing homelessness throughout Santa Clara County. And as you can see from the chart on the left, that number has grown over the years. It's been pretty steady the past couple of years, but compared to 7, 8 years, was that 15 years ago, we've seen a big increase. And that's not a surprise to any of us who live here, right? We see signs of it. We see encampments on the side of the road. We come across people who are clearly suffering. So we have a really big crisis upon us. One thing that's kind of unique, because this is not a unique problem to our community. I think throughout California and big cities, really across the US, we're seeing a lot more people experiencing homelessness. But one thing that's kind of unique for our community and really California as a whole is that the vast majority of these people are unsheltered. And that means there are people who are living on the streets, in our parks, near the creeks, in their car, in a tent, versus somewhere with a roof over their head. And there's a lot of reasons for that, which we'll get today. But I think that's one reason it's a lot more visible. And we're really seeing the signs as a community grappling for what it means that there are these many human beings in our community without a place to live. The other thing to remember is that it's a problem that's affecting throughout our community. I think probably when the problem was smaller and less visible, we've always had thousands of people who were unstably housed, but when it was less visible, you wouldn't really come across it unless you were in downtown San Jose, if you're walking along our creeks. But with this homeless census, so every 2 years we count the number of people experiencing homeless in our community, which is where the data from the slide before came. We also look at where they are. And you can see every one of these communities. I'm guessing a lot of you live in San Jose, but even smaller cities, we're seeing people experiencing homelessness, all but maybe the very smallest communities on our western edge. And it really reinforces the point. This is a community-wide problems because it's growing bigger. We're seeing more visible signs of it everywhere, but all the forces, all the factors that lead to homelessness affect our entire community. And it means that we all are going to have to be part of the solution if we want to solve homelessness. Who is homeless in our community? One of the great and most interesting things I think come out of the census is some of the surveying data that says what is the population experiencing homelessness look like. And I think it's really interesting because it busts some of the myths, some of the stereotypes we have about who's experiencing homelessness and why. A big one we hear all the time is that, hey, it's California. We have great weather. We have great service for a progressive area. We're bringing in all sorts of people. Homeless people are coming here. 85% of people who we found said they were living in the county when they became homeless. So it really is our problem and part of our reason we're forcing people on the streets, whether we want to or not. 84% are interested in housing. We always hear that all the time. Oh, no, they want to live outside. No, vast majority, if there was an opportunity to come inside, they would take it. 54% lost their home to divorce, lost job, or eviction is kind of a different reasons, but we put those together because those are some of the more popular responses. And it flies in the face of what I think we all see, what we hear often is mental health, substance abuse. That's the main driver of homelessness. There's a connection there. We'll talk a little bit more about it, but the main driver are these other issues, not those kind of more personal addiction related issues. And then the last ones are smaller minorities, but it kind of goes to show that we have a diverse homeless population. They're just as diverse as the community itself, right? We have people who are veterans, there are kids, people your age experiencing homelessness, people who are in the foster care system. We see a strong connection there. and people with a disabling condition, which something we don't think a lot about, but makes sense, right? People who have a disabling condition aren't able to be as self-sufficient. And unfortunately, in this community, that means you're at higher risk for falling into homelessness. The other thing that we make a point to talk is about the racial disparities, something that is rightfully getting a lot more attention over the past couple of years. And unfortunately, as we see with any other major issue plaguing our community, unfortunately, it's those people of color who are bearing the brunt of it. So these charts here show what are some different racial demographics, what's their percent in the overall population versus the homeless population. And we see it's way more, huge disparities. And as we all know, it's not because of some inherent issue about what we are, right? How we are based on our skin color, everything else. We know that's not the issue, but it goes back to these societal forces that are putting certain people of color really at disadvantage or face greater risks for falling into homelessness. So lots of bad news there about what the crisis looks like. But the thing I always like to say up front before we get too pressed is it can lead to a sense of hopelessness, but it's not hopeless. We have seen in other communities, and we've seen signs of success here, that we can end homelessness if we really invest in the type of housing solutions that we need. And we're talking a little bit more about why we focus there. And hopefully by the time I'm we have a little bit of hope in this really serious problem that we can all work together to make a dent in homelessness in our community. So one of the most important questions I think we have to ask ourselves is, why is there so much homelessness here in Silicon Valley? And I really think about it in that issue. Why is there homelessness in our community? There are lots of reasons an individual becomes homeless, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But the thing I think is most interesting is, why do we see it so much here? Why do we see it so much here where there's a lot of money, where there's a lot of wealth, where we're a very progressive community? And it really leads to the answer that we have to look at this issue from a big systemic force of what are all these things, the factors of why we see homelessness here, but maybe not other communities, and not other communities where there's high poverty or other factors that we may think may be leading to homelessness. And so a little bit of context about here in our community too, because I think when we talk about why is there so much homelessness in our community, the first thing that a lot of people say is, well, we're not doing anything. Nothing's working, right? We're just sitting here letting this problem grow out of control. But I can guarantee you that's not the case. As I mentioned, our organization was formed to really start bringing people together to try to address the problem. And we really started getting some steam about 2015, about 7 years ago, where we were finally getting people to invest in some really important things. And the chart on the left is really important because in that time, we have helped thousands and really now tens of thousands of people exit homelessness. People who were experiencing homelessness, we got them into a stable home, starting with about 2,000 people in 2015 when we really started ramping up our first series campaigns to about 3,000. And if you looked into the years after then, that's grown a little bit more. So thousands, tens of thousands of people we've gotten into homelessness. But why is the problem grown? Why is it even more visible than ever? It's the stat on the right. And this is an important one. So we're going to come back to this one in a little bit towards the end of the presentation. But even as we're putting thousands of people, helping them get into housing, we're seeing way more fall into homelessness for the first time. There's a stat called inflow. Inflow is the technical term. Number of people coming into homelessness for the first time. And so for every family we got out of homelessness, in 2018, I think this number showed 2 to 3 more were falling into homelessness for the very first time. And that's important because that's a key factor. Things are happening where we're helping people, but the problem is growing because there are these things that are pushing more people into homelessness. And it's really kind of the eye-opening moment for people of, if we're going to solve the problem, we have to understand why there's so many people falling into homelessness in the first place. And so as I alluded to before, we can look at individual factors. It's interesting, it's important to know what may lead an individual to fall into homelessness. But the reason we're seeing this at such scale is because there's big structural societal forces that are pushing vulnerable people to the brink. And, this isn't just me saying it. If we're only out of time, we could spend an hour and a half talking about this. We're going to do a quick preview of it. But if you start looking into the research, the data, people who study this issue, there is a lot more evidence that it's structural, systemic, societal issues that cause homelessness than any individual ones. And a lot of the data points that there are a lot of different issues. These aren't all of it, but 4 of the most prominent ones that lead to a lot more homelessness in any given community. Rising economic inequality, a lack of affordable housing. We're going to talk about those 2 a little bit more here because they're really important. Underinvestment in the programs to serve most vulnerable residents. As we have more people being pushed into homelessness or on the verge on it, are there the resources there to help them and make sure that they have a safety net? And 4th, we touched about it earlier, systemic structural racism, the legacy and some of the continuing forces that are still out there, how we can create challenges and disadvantages for a big segment of our community and put these folks at risk for homelessness and drive our overall numbers up. So I'm going to take just a few minutes to talk about these first two issues because I think that's where the data shows there's really the strongest correlation, but how income inequality and housing inaffordability really lead to a lot of homelessness. And this is from data right from our community. So it's really local and can really be demonstrated for how the crisis we're facing here has these really economic and structural forces in it. So first one we see is this is a chart here, really interesting one that looks at the average rent, which is way too high in our community, but how much money you would have to make to be able to afford the average apartment. And from this analysis, they show you have to make about $46 an hour or $8,000 a month to afford the average asking rent in the community and have enough money left over to pay for other basic things. $46 an hour is quite a bit of money. That's 2.5 times most of the minimum wages in our community. And if you look at the bars in green or that's the average wage for a lot of jobs that are, middle to lower class jobs. These aren't people who are at the bottom of the barrel. You see minimum wage on there, but other jobs that are decent jobs. And in other communities, you could be able to afford a home. But here, it's nowhere close to what you need to be able to afford the average rent. So there's a huge part of our segments of our community who are struggling just to be able to afford the rent. And if you look at it, it's nowhere close to the $46 an hour, but look at how much you have to make just to cover the rent itself and nothing else. Some of those are barely above it. So a really good sign that the income inequality and where some of the people who are making on the lower ends simply can't afford to live here. It plays out in this chart here, which was another analysis that looked at, if you look at different income brackets, and the label's kind of confusing, so ignore that. But each of these bars represent people who are earning different amounts of money in our community. The bottom black one are people who make about the average amount of income in the community. The top one, the green one, are really low income people. We call them extremely low income households. People make about a third of the average income. And so because of what we saw, because there's this huge gap, if you're making about average income, of every 100 households average income, you're going to find about 96 apartments. There's about 96 apartments they could afford in the community. So there's enough housing for them. But if you look at these really low, extremely low income people, there's not enough housing they can afford. Only 32 of those 100 households are going to be able to find an apartment out there that matches what they can afford based on their income. And the rest of them are quite frankly, are screwed a little bit, right? They're not going to be able to find an affordable place to live. And so another factor showing that these two factors, the fact of what we're making and how much affordable housing we have aren't in match, are really putting pressure on vulnerable folks. And the last one we see here is the same thing. Each of those buckets there, these columns on the right, represents a different income threshold. So if we go back to the lowest income folks, which is now on the right, of those folks, 71% of them are what we consider severely rent burdened. And that means they're spending more of half of their income on rent. And when you do that, there's not a whole lot of money left for other basic necessities like food, medical expenses, transportation, school, clothes, right? We're not even talking about vacation or going out to dinner or to the movies for the basic income. And when you have that many people who are rent burdened, they're just one paycheck away. Hopefully they're housed, but maybe this already so overwhelming they're not housed. But if they are, there's not a lot of wiggle room left that if something happens, they're not going to be pushed out in the streets. And what's really interesting is hopefully this kind of shows the dire situation people are in. But there've been studies here, and I need to add slides here to show that these are correlated. Research have looked at people. If you have high rent burdens, if you have high rents, we've seen that there's a huge correlation to how much homelessness there's in the community. There's a book that was recently done by some data researchers that says it's called Homelessness is a Housing Problem. And they looked at communities all around the world and said, in communities where this happens, they have high income inequality and rent, there's a lot more homelessness. They did not find that same correlation in communities where there's higher drug abuse, higher levels of mental health issues, even just higher levels of poverty. It really has to do with this correlation of income and housing. And so it's one of the reasons we look at this as one of those really big issues we have to solve to get into homelessness. So I'm going to take a pause there, take a sip of coffee. Went through a lot of issues. We are going to talk about how we're going to solve this because this leads us to the way for solutions. But before then, I would love to pause if there are any questions or comments folks have so far.
Questions? Yeah, just go.
When it comes to like data research and like data collection, do you guys do like third party or do you do it all in house?
We do very little of this. Great question. We do very little of the data collection ourselves. So we get our data from two different places. One's third-party experts. So some of the data I just showed you, like looking at like economics and stuff, there are think tanks and people who look at communities all around the world. So we use their data. The data from before, when we're looking at like who's experiencing homelessness in our community, a lot of different sources, two main ones, neither one which we do. One is this annual or biannual census, where community members throughout the community is led by our county government but they get volunteers to go out and count everybody, right? So it's like a census, much like the usual US Census, but just of homeless people. The other data source, a really important one, is because the county is kind of the main factor in doing all these services and programs. They have a database that tracks people who are receiving or seeking assistance. So they have really rich data on people who are in the system or coming to the system. They can let us know what are the numbers and what are the profiles of people who are coming to us for help.
Alexis, go ahead.
Just out of curiosity, what does the more like business side of the nonprofit work you do look like?
Sure. So, again, ours is a little bit different. So I don't know how relevant it will be for when you talk to other nonprofits, but for us, we spend a lot of times because of this unique nature on really bringing people together and driving strategies. So one way we do that, we think if we're trying to get everyone to row in the same direction, we do a lot of convening. We host conferences, we have meetings, we are the center of what you're gonna see amidst the continuum of care that gets everyone to come together and say, all right, what's our strategy? If we're gonna build more housing, which you're gonna hear why it's so important, who's doing what? Where do we need to find funding? So it's a convening role, right? Convening and facilitating success. Another thing we do is because we think the private sector is a huge part of it, we help raise private funds that can go into these strategies. So we don't, I mean, we need to keep up money for our operations, but we have some big contributions from tech giants like Cisco and Apple that they said we want to be part of the solution. And so we're bringing private funds in. And when we talk about building housing, we know there's a lot of government money, but the other things that private funders can help. So how do we put private funding in to go do this? Someone asked about data before. We don't do the data ourselves, but sometimes we're going to sponsor it. We know having this research is helpful, so we may conduct studies that gives us insights into how we can solve this problem. And then on my end, what my part of the shop does is we do a lot of the advocacy. So we know to solve this problem, we need government officials, legislators, city councils to make the right policy decisions. How can we influence that? How can we give them data to help them make better decisions? How can we help them develop proposals or influence and advocate for them when they come? And then the communications front like this, speaking to groups like you to help them understand the issue and rally them towards what we think are the solutions we need.
And then Edison and Joshua.
Right, I'm just curious, what's the process of connecting the homeless with the housing? Is it like a long, convoluted process or something simpler?
It can be, I wish to say that it would be super simple, but it's complicated by two factors. So the process itself is not super hard. We have something, it's called coordinated assessment in our community, where a lot of our programs use, it's not a single door. You can go many places to get assessed, but the same criteria for how you get connected to a different program service. And it's important for two reasons. One, because we have limited resources, so we want to do it fairly. But two, it makes sure that we're connecting people to the type of programs they need, right? Some person may have a lot of different issues. They need a very service-intensive environment and a long-term support. Other people may have just went into one emergency, and if we can help connect them to someone who can help pay their back rent, they're going to be good going forward. So it's a coordinated assessment, and it can look differently depending on people's circumstance, but it's usually an assessment. You meet with a case manager. It doesn't take too long, an hour or two, to find out about your situation, and then you try to get matched to a program. The reason why it's kind of convoluted, takes a long time, is we don't have enough resources, right? If we have 100 people coming for help, usually we'll have resources to help maybe a third or half of them. So the process could be a little bit better where it's a little bit easier, but the longer time of why it takes some time to wait is we just don't have enough places for people to go.
Yeah. Joshua.
How do you like basically convince private corporations and stuff to help fund? Because it seems, as far as I've heard, it seems like it can be a little bit hard to do that.
It's super hard. I mean, it's hard because I'll say, all right, so, my personal political background is we're all in this together and we need everyone to pitch in. And that means the private sector, and particularly because, as we know here, there's a lot of money in the private sector. So not everyone shares that philosophy sometimes. So sometimes you go in and talk to corporations and, just not it. They're looking at their bottom line and they don't want to do it. We're not going to have much success with them. For other people, and I mentioned Cisco and Apple because they're great. They invested a lot of money, and I don't know what's mean to you, but they gave us, our organization, over the past 10 years, $50 million each, which is huge money for a nonprofit. And it was because they really care. They saw that this is a problem in our community. And it's a long way of saying that when we've been able to articulate, not just us, but other organizations, that this is a crisis that is really big and we're only going to solve it when we get through with it, they're more willing to go. They want to lean in. They want to be part of the solution. And, for us, one thing we've done, as you can see from our presentation so far, is we take a very data-informed approach, right? It's not just all about philosophy and ideology and we want to do good. We do say that, but here's how we think we can solve the problem. Here's what we know about the problem and how we're going to do it. And that's helped us gain some credibility and get some more money out of folks. That's kind of how we've done it, but it's not easy, right? Some don't care, as I mentioned before, but the other one is just there's a lot of needs in our community. I happen to think homelessness is the biggest one, but you can't say that food insecurity isn't important. We can't say that our racial justice work in our community is important. We can't say the environment's not important. So the other challenge is trying to find what matters to people in these corporations and knowing that they want to be, some of those who do want to help, they have limited ways to get involved. So a very convoluted answer, but we try to bring the data forward. We try to show them the severity of the issue as well as where their money can make a difference. And we've had some success, but we need to raise a lot more money if we're going to solve this problem in our community.
So should you keep going?
All right, well, we'll keep going. We're about halfway through, but now it's kind of fun part, talking about solutions, because, I think it's important we start with the crisis and particularly why there's a crisis, because I think there's a lot of misperceptions. And again, we go back to our stereotypes, which is natural for us of what homelessness looks like. But it's an important thing. And again, if you leave nothing else from this presentation, hopefully just get you to think a little bit more about the issue. Dig down a layer under it and don't just take my word for it, read more about it. But that's going to be important because these solutions are not rocket science, but it goes in the face of we had to put some thought behind of what it really means, of why we have homelessness and how we can solve it. So I alluded to it just a minute before, but since really for the past, dozen years we've been around and increasingly, we've really been trying to bring everyone together to attack this problem. No one's going to solve it on their own. We're only going to do it if we can get all sorts of our community rowing together. And we have a coalition called the Continuum of Care, who really is one of these big movers and shakers of efforts to address homelessness. And you can see some of those groups we mentioned on the left who are part of it. But as part of this process, every 5 years, we come together to develop a community plan to end homelessness. And, when I first heard about it, I thought, oh, just another report, papers on it. It's really important for a couple of reasons. One, because there's so many different entities working on this, we need to be aligned, whether it's in a report or not, but we need to be aligned on how we're going to address the problem because we're all going to have to row in the same direction, all put our resources and energies towards a common goal. So that's one reason important. And second is because we need to have goals. We need to have metrics on it. A big goal of solving homelessness is important, but we're only going to get there if we have really tangible targets for what we're going to do along the way. So our community plan has both, and we'll talk a little more about the targets a little bit later, but really what it is we have all the things we think we need to do to move the needle on homelessness. And it's really based on 3 reinforcing strategies that are really important. One, we need to address the root causes of homelessness, the things that we just heard about, by adopting policies and system change that get to the core of the problem. We're never going to get down, as you saw before, 1 people we get housed, 2 to 3 more come in if we don't attack those root economic societal factors for why we have homelessness in the first place. So we need to make inroads there. 2, it goes back to what we we're just talking about. We have some programs, and you're going to hear more about how they're successful, but we have to scale them. Right now, we're only able to help about, I'm making up a number here, a quarter, a third. It's a minority of the people who come for help. How are we investing in solutions at a level that matches the severity of the crisis so that people are stably housed? And then third is because both of those 2 things are going to take some time, and we know that this crisis is having all sorts of impacts in our community, we have to take immediate actions. We have to do things right now that help meet the basic needs of people who are unsheltered, people who have nowhere else to go, and address all the other impacts that we see in our community because there's so much homelessness. If you're interested in looking on it, it's worth the read. You can go to our website, a lot of the places to look at the community plan. It's just a screenshot, but what you can see is within each of those big bucket strategies, we have a lot of individual actions and sub-strategies of the things we think we need to do to move those things forward. And so this plan, again, is a really good comprehensive approach for the type of actions we need to do. And if we do them all in concert, we're going to see a reduction of homelessness in our community. And again, it's a really good organizing principle for all the people who want to solve this to realize where they can plug in and how we can mutually reinforce our efforts to attack this issue. This slide talks about some of the key strategies. This is probably only about maybe a quarter or a fifth of the strategies that are in the whole plan, but it gives you a sense of what the type of things we're talking about. We're talking about trying to build more affordable housing in the community. We saw before of why that's a core cause of it, so let's get to the core of it. It's about making sure that people have a living wage employment. How can we attack income inequality on the other side and make sure people have sustainable efforts? It's about increasing our programs to get more people into housing or prevent them from falling into housing in the first place. It means increasing the number of temporary options we have, shelters, interim housing, transitional places that can be that first step for someone in the recovery because we can't build all this housing overnight. And it means increasing other services. We know that people who are falling to homelessness, housing is the reason their lack of housing is why they're homeless, but they're having all sorts of other issues. So how can we scale mental health, substance abuse services, along with job training, other things that we know are important to make people healthy and can bring in that wraparound we need for those who are experiencing homelessness. And it's that broader approach that is really embodied in this plan. It's called the Housing First approach. You may have heard about it, but it's the idea of that if we're going to address homelessness, the most central and the first thing we do is get them housed, but that also we're wrapping around all sorts of other services, because after you've been on the streets, even if it's just a little bit of time, you're going to have other issues that you're going to deal with. And it's important because at the core of it, of what Housing First means, is housing is the center. The reason we have homelessness is because they don't have a home. It's as simple as that. And that's got to be the core of the solution. We have to make sure they get connected to housing and make sure they get connected to housing first. Because once they're stably housed, once you don't have to worry about where you're going to sleep the next night, are you safe in your community? Are you safe around, are your belongings safe? You can start addressing other challenges you might have in your life. And so I think, this is important because, your teacher alluded to this in the beginning to it. Sometimes people think housing first means we only care about housing and nothing else. But you can see here is housing first means let's get them the housing at the center, but let's make sure they have all the other support they need to address other issues. And that means make sure that they have access to services that can help them if they have an addiction. It means if they have mental health issues, they're getting the care they need. It means they're getting connections to help get training or opportunities for jobs. And so it's a really holistic approach that is really important and central. The housing has to come first, because as opposed to other things we did for decades called treatment first, you had to be sober, you have to have a job before you get the housing. It doesn't work because if you don't have, again, back to that core idea, if you don't have a stable place to live, you're not going to be very successful in addressing other issues in your life. But this is what is the premise for our approach. And not because we only think it's the right thing to do, it's successful. We have a lot of housing first programs, and one of the big ones is it's called permanent supportive housing. It's how we can get people into a permanent home at a rent they can afford and with those services around them. And what we've seen is 96%, the overwhelming percentage of those folks are stably housed, and they're going to remain stably housed a year later. And we've done other longitudinal studies that say they stay housed a lot longer than that, but this is kind of the one benchmark. So we've seen huge success for this type of approach to actually getting people out of homelessness into a stable home and on the path to a more healthy lifestyle. But it's not only good for them, it's good for our community, this approach. We have to make choices as a community all the time. I saw this every time I was in the mayor's office. There are many good things we want to do, but we have limited dollars or energy. And so we had to say, is this going to benefit the community? Is there going to be a good trade-off? And we see the same thing for supportive housing. We've done studies to see what does it mean for the overall ecosystem? If we're going to put money into supportive housing, what financial benefits do we get? And what we see is that by investing in that housing, we get all sorts of savings on the service side. We spend about $500 million a year in our community just responding to homelessness, just responding because there's an encampment that needs to be cleaned up, just responding because there's a mental health emergency and we need to send the paramedics or the cops, fires that break out for it. When we started housing people back in 2015 or so, there's a program called Housing 1000, and we focus on 1,000 most chronically homeless individuals. We put them into housing, and what we saw is before they were housed, the average person consumed about $62,000 in government services because of all those things. We had to respond to whatever the emergency was on the street. Once we got them into housing, that number dropped to 19,000, mostly medical care or the kind of emergencies that could happen to any one of us when we're housed. And so that's a huge reduction in what we see on savings that in many times was more savings than the cost of housing. So it's another reason that we believe that building in supportive housing is not only the right thing to do, good for the individual, but has community benefits as well. A few more slides here to take your questions. So we have this housing first principle. It's a peak part of the community plan. It only works if we build more of the housing, right? We can all be buying the approach, but as you saw from the slides before, there's not enough affordable housing in our community. People are struggling to pay rent. So a key thing that we focus on Destination Home as our nonprofit, as well as this plan, is building more of what we call this deeply affordable housing. A lot of confusion around what it is. You can read a little bit on the slide, but at the end of the day, it's a home, usually an apartment, where we control the rent to a level someone can afford. And what we want to do is we need to build a lot of affordable housing in our community, a lot of people struggling. But if we're going to address homelessness, we need two types in particular. We need affordable housing for those extremely low income households, the people who make the least amount, because we know those are the people who will be homeless if we don't have affordable place for them to go. And we need more supportive housing units. You saw the success on the slides before. These are the ones where you have that affordable apartment with the wraparound services, and it's proven incredibly effective for those who are experiencing homelessness and how we can get them assisted. We're making some great progress. We passed an affordable housing bond about 5 years ago now, and we're putting that money into building affordable housing. On the map, you can see we're building it all throughout the community, and we're going to be trying to get into every one of the cities in Santa Clara County. We put these money into 40 developments that have 4,000 new apartments. All of them are being built. About 1,000 of them are already open. We've gotten 2,000 people off the street in these 1,200 units. And over the next few years, we're going to keep adding more of them. And that's going to help us get more people into housing, as you saw before. Important to, I always put this slide up here to see what they look like. We all have, I think, stereotypes again, like, oh, it's going to be like a mental institution or the projects, which we heard scary things about back in the days. But these are beautiful apartments. I would live there if they had openings for us. You can see they're great design. They're a home. They look better, in my opinion, than a lot of other apartment buildings you see growing up, you see going up elsewhere around there. And so they're good. They really are a community asset. It's something that we all should be embracing because it makes our neighborhoods better. And most importantly, for the people who live there. You know, one of the great things about my jobs, I get to talk to a lot of people and meet with people, and you hear about their struggles. It's very humbling, but also gratifying when you can see what a difference a stable home makes in their life. And so, you know, this is a mother and a daughter who have been housed through these programs. And, you know, the quote in the right thing really encapsulates about the housing first approach and why it's so important. All the things that opens up for their life and their future by having a stable home. And these are the type of things that keep me going and keep our community going, of why we need to keep getting more people housed and build the housing to support them. So when we talked about the community plan before, we talked about all the goals we have. Here are some of them. You can see we're well on our way. There's some more ways, some work to do, but we're halfway through that 5-year plan, and we're starting to get more people housed, reducing the number of people who are becoming homeless, scaling our programs. And the last slide comes back to, or second to last slide, that thing I showed before, right? The reason we have so much homeless in the community, we're housing a lot of people, but way more people are falling into homelessness. That 2 to 3 to 1 stat represents what we're at in 2018. Here in 2021, and we need to run these numbers again for 2022, we're narrowing the gap. Less people are becoming homeless. More people are getting to housing. I think in 2022, you're going to see that gap even shrink further, but we're getting close to what we call functional zero. If we can get it to where our community is helping more people come out of homelessness than go in, we're going to start seeing rewards in the community. So this really shows why we haven't seen a noticeable difference in there. We're starting from such a deficit. We're making progress. But once we can flip those around, which I think is, you know, we're going to start seeing that in the next couple of years, we can get to the point where we're really seeing more tangible progress on this big crisis. So closing thoughts, what can you do to get involved? You're taking the first step today, continue educating yourself. Go to our website, go find other resources, learn about this issue. There's a lot of complexities, a lot of nuance. The one thing I say is look for it. The good articles will reference where they're getting the resources from. Everyone's opining about homelessness right now, but the information you want are people who are backing up their arguments with data and actual real work. Second, get proximate. There are a lot of great other nonprofits who are doing work in the community that are really hands-on. Home First is a nonprofit here in San Jose that runs shelters, interim housing. They will have great volunteer opportunities. PATH, people assisting the homelessness, same ones. Just get involved, right? It's an opportunity to meet people, hear about their struggles, see it up front, and understand the level of challenge we're dealing with in our community. And then third, you know, get involved. You hear this all the time, but it's true. Decisions are made by people who show up, who vote, who go speak at city council meetings, are advocating legislature, and we need all this public will. You know, it was one of those circles in our coalition. If we don't have the community with us, we're not going to do it because we're talking about hard stuff. We're talking about investing in solutions. We're talking about building more housing. And so if you believe, like we do, that we need to do these things to solve homelessness, get involved. And there's many ways you can do it, but if you really want to focus on homelessness issues, we have an initiative here called Housing Ready Communities, where we collect emails, we get people involved, and we let you know when there's opportunities to show up. And so we can hopefully use our collective voice to push for solutions. So I'm going to go and stop there. I already went longer, even though I tried to be shorter again. So thank you for your patience. But would love to spend whatever time you guys have to hear other questions you have, or your reactions to this information, or your thoughts about this really tough topic in our community.
Let's do some more questions. Who's got one? You can just read it from your card. Yeah, Troy.
You mentioned like the strategies you guys have. Do you do them all three at once, or are you going like one at a time?
We're doing all three at once. I mean, these are big strategies, and it's not just us, right? We're one part of the system, but our whole system, we need to move all together because all these things are going to take time. We need to both address root causes, build more housing, and do these immediate interventions to help with it. And so because we have a big coalition, different organizations are leading on different things. That's why we can do more things at once, but the whole thing needs to move in unison to have an impact.
Yeah, Nicholas and then Alexis.
How long does it take for you guys to build like a property, and how do you choose a right location where people won't get mad at where you guys building?
Yeah, great question. So it takes way too long. I would say between when we start thinking about building and we, the collective we, building an affordable housing development until it actually opens, we're talking 3-4 years in the best case period. Some of that's construction, some of it's bureaucratic process, right? You have to get your entitlements, you have to get the funding together. So we're looking at one of our goals, one of the ways that we, Destination Homes specifically, are trying to lean in to see how we can make that quicker, because there are people who are suffering and dying on the street. So how can we do it quicker? But it just takes a long time. Finding a right site is hard for two reasons. One, there's just not a lot of land left in our community, right? It's getting built up. So just finding somewhere available is important. We also want to be a good site where for people, if you're very low income or you're homeless, you need to be close to services, close to transit, you might have a job. So that kind of narrows it. And then the last one is what you said, right? Where people don't get mad about it. That's not going to happen. Every site we have, because of you've heard the term NIMBYism or just stereotypes, they're not thrilled about having this around here. But, if you have community conversations, if more people like you guys show up, it can grease the wheels a little bit. So we have to take into account. That's part of the reason it takes so long to do it. But it's something that we're trying to overcome because we need this housing. As you saw from there, right? These are great looking apartment building complexes. Once they're up, we have people walk by all the time say, oh, I didn't even know that was an affordable housing development. And that just speaks to the fact these are great things that are good for our community.
How has the COVID pandemic impacted your ability to kind of like reach the goals or like make progress to the same extent that you've wanted to?
Yeah, it's been hard. I think it's actually been a mixed bag. I'll say it's made it harder, right? I think the biggest one is that when the pandemic hit, we all in some shape or form had to pivot to work on something else, right? Some more immediate needs. So even like I would say mostly our government partners, they were working about public health measures and there was less attention they could put to this. So it really took a little steam out. The good news and why it hasn't been catastrophic for us is it did open up new opportunities. There was more funding that came from the federal government, right? There was more emergency measures that came into place. So with this funding, we could build more housing. We did more temporary interim. We got people into motels, which is a better situation. We actually had more money to build more housing. So that's good. It also gave with these emergency powers. One reason we didn't see it explode in pandemic is that here in our community, and many other ones, we had eviction moratoriums. We were able to put in some protections in place that reduced that inflow we talked about. So overall, we know who knows what would have happened. There were some things that made it harder, things that opened up new opportunities. I think we're pretty fortunate that we're still moving in the right direction. But we're probably, I don't know if we're behind or not, but it was a whole new challenge we had to figure out how to grapple with together.
Well, why don't we do do you want to talk any more about the issue of like why is housing first versus why isn't mental health first or drug addiction first?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for reminding us. I didn't touch on that as much, but I'll say something that's not going to surprise all of you, right? I think in our mind, the stereotype of the vision we have of someone who's homeless is someone who's suffering from some kind of mental health or drug addiction issue. And it's because these are the ones who are probably most visible or most disruptive on the street, right? There are so many people who as I've spent more time in the creeks and elsewhere, you see people who actually, they have jobs, they have other things going on, but they're just they have nowhere to live. But the ones we see, the ones that are in our face are those people who are having more serious challenges. So for us as humans, we know that visceral reaction is what we associate with homelessness. But if you look at it, it's only probably a minor percentage of the people who are suffering homelessness. I think I've seen stats. There's no really reliable way, but we're talking about a quarter of the people, right? So there's just this big disconnect on it. But that said we also think that for those people, and for a lot of them who have maybe less severe challenges, they need the support services. And so when we talk about housing first, again, the most important thing is it's not housing only. I think there's a lot of people who've spun it that way, say we only care about housing and nothing else. Couldn't be further from the truth. If you look at that wheel again too, you actually saw addiction recovery, mental health stuff on there. And so what we want to do is we want to wrap around those services to help people for those who need it. What we're just saying with Housing First is housing's got to be the core of the solution. We have to get people in housing first so they're stabilized so they can take advantage of the services. And again, I'm going to point out there's more and more studies, and if you're interested, I'm happy to show it to you. It's more successful that way. When we've had it was probably maybe 20 or 30 years in the 80s and 90s, we had most communities did a treatment first approach. Said you got to get sober before you get into housing. And what we saw is unfortunately some people did it, but a lot of people couldn't do it, right? They just weren't in the place where they could address their addiction recovery, their mental health issues while living on the streets because they're worried with surviving. They're worried about where am I going to sleep the next night. They're going to be worried about how are they not going to get assaulted? What's going to happen to my belongings? But since we've done the housing first approach, we make housing first, we actually see people more stably housed. And we actually see for those who need help and are going to want help, higher participation in some of those other services that can help them be more stable and more healthy going forward.
That's good. Good. Do we have one more question? Yeah, Crystal, go ahead.
So does this become their permanent address after they move in?
I'm sorry, can you say that again? I couldn't quite hear you.
Does the apartment complex become their permanent address after they move in?
It can be. We talk about the gold standard, and it's a little bit of a misnomer of finding people with a permanent home. And usually what we mean that is it's different than a shelter or different than things that are a transitional home where you only have a couple months to stay. So for a lot of people, we're putting them to a home that they can choose to stay on forever, if things work out. And for a lot of people, it will, right? A lot of people, what we're talking about is they find a affordable apartment, they get a job, they're moving on, they're great. Other people, they start making more money, they're going to go find somewhere else to live. And we hear those stories too. Other people who are disabled, who have longer term issues, this probably will be their permanent home because they're always going to need some support. And then because we have a lot of different programs, I didn't go too much into them, but some of them are also things we're doing that we built specifically for people temporarily because that's all they think they're going to need, right? People who don't have serious health issues or other disabling conditions may just need a little help with rent. So we run a homeless prevention program where we help them pay off their back rent, make sure they're stabilized, and it's time limited, right? We're going to help them for 6 months, a year, whatever they need. So for everyone's a different situation. We have different programs, but the goal is whether it's in that place or somewhere else, that everyone else is in a stable long-term home.
Good.
How do you stop them against prejudice when they apply for jobs? Because there's a lot of prejudice when they see the location of their home and that it's funded by like a program like this.
That is a huge problem in many different realms. So that's one thing I wish I told you we had a solution on, but it's a key one of these root causes that was in that first bucket of the strategy that we need to address. And I don't have a good answer, but I'll say there's a couple of things we need to do. One starts with things like this, and I think what I'm always excited about meeting young people about is that you guys have the open mind that hopefully we can slowly combat that prejudice. Because it's a long term. We try to educate people, we try to get people more proximate so they're not so dismissive of someone just because they have this. The second thing we're doing is it goes back more on the policy side. There are some laws that have been passed that keep you from discriminating someone against someone from renting an apartment just because you have help from a subsidy. We have a lot more work to do to enforce it and make those laws stronger and accountable, but that's one way we can do it. On the job front, it's a lot harder too, but we're trying to not only look at it legislatively, but have more programs that can help people get their foot in the door. Because I think the hardest thing when it comes to jobs is, especially when there's more applicants than a person, right? The employer is going to want to find someone who seems less risky. And so one way we're trying to do it besides, the legislative is, do we have programs that can help people as soon as they're firstly housed and now looking to get back on with the rest of their lives, some of the training and the things so that they have that first job. They're better presented when they come to an interview, or even just have a job history again, because I think there are a lot more people who are willing to give a chance of seeing, okay, they've had a job beforehand now to it. And, I think they're ready for something more. So not an easy answer, but there's different ways we're trying to get to that because we have to solve that part of the problem too.
Awesome. All right. I think we've taken a lot of your time. So
Not a problem. Hey, you guys were great. Thank you. You guys had great questions and I really appreciate it.
Yeah, David, thanks for taking the time. I'll see you Wednesday. And we'll keep gathering questions and we might email you back and ask you some more. So
That sounds great. You
Sounds
guys have
good.
a great rest of your day. Great weekend.
later. Thanks, David. Okay.